probably most confusing story in the Magnus Archives is the one of the house on Hilltop Road. Its story stretches over several statements, and let's be honest, we all forgot at least half of the stuff that was going on there. So here is a comprehensive summary of the story of the most famous house in the Magnus Archives. The before-mentioned house resides in a rather secluded street in the Crowley area of Oxford, with the house number 150. It has 2 floors, a loft, and a creepy tree in the garden. Unfortunately, even the great Martin Blackwood couldn't find the exact date when the house was built, but the earliest record he could find were about when the house was bought by Walter Fielding in 1891. Later it was apparently inherited, first by his son Alfred in 1923, and then by his grandson Raymond in 1957. Which leads us to the wild 60s, where Raymond uses his house as a halfway house for the troubled youth, which the neighborhood doesn't really appreciate, but Raymond was too well-liked for them to complain too much. At some point, the troublemakers of the house started to behave themselves, probably because he hypnotized them by forcing them to stare at a weird web table every Sunday, which made them lose all memory of looking at it afterwards. It was decorated by strange, swirling designs and patterns, and a small, square box was carved in the middle. One of the teens that lived there at the time, Ronald Sinclair, reported that once the children became 18, they were taken away by a suited figure. Luckily for him, Agnes Montague appeared in the house before it was his turn to be taken away. She was sent there by the cult of the Lightless Flame, because they didn't know how to treat the child avatar they made for their ritual to end the world. At the time, she looked around 11, but of course appearances can deceive when you are looking at an avatar. Nobody seemed to know who she was, but Ronald thought that Raymond was afraid of her. Once Ronald became 18, the before-mentioned suited man appeared, but Agnes gave him a kiss on the cheek, which proved to be important later. Once the suited man left him to supposedly bring his car around, a compulsion hit Ronald, which made him return to the house. And there he goes to Raymond's study, where stairs lead him down to a cellar, in which all of the other children that turned 18 before him laid around wrapped in egg sacks. Raymond was also there, but he seemed weird, with stuff shifting around him and spiders coming out of his clothes. Ronald gets the compulsion to open the box in the table and eat the apple he found in it, but the place where Agnes kissed him started burning, which made him concentrate enough to escape. Clearly the house was used by the web as a harvest place for people that society doesn't care about, but it is never made clear if the man in the suit is part of the whole plan. He at least seemed to show up for every disappearing kid and never told anyone of the disappearances, so it seems likely. In the following years, the residents seemed to disappear without a trace, one after the other, without their disappearance getting noticed, until the only people still living in the house were Agnes and Raymond. Around 7 years after Agnes appeared, Raymond disappears as well. Of course, Agnes was questioned, but she claimed he had just gone away and that the house was hers now. There was an investigation, but the house was legally signed over to her. There were no signs of foul play, and Raymond remained missing. Agnes continued living in the house for several more years. Meanwhile, the outdoor pets of the neighborhood started disappearing. In 1974, a 5-year-old kid called Henry White went missing, and people started suspecting Agnes. So when her house caught fire, nobody did anything until it burned to the ground. The only body found in the ruins is the one of Raymond Fielding, with his right hand missing. Raymond's obituary reports his death to have been due to a house fire, with no further details given. What he did in between his disappearance and his death is never explained. It isn't quite clear why the house burned down, but Eugene Wonderstock, one of the cult members that made Agnes, believes that there was a fight between Agnes and Raymond, and that it scarred the place more than could be seen by the eye. A scar in reality that later on was compounded by interferences with the other powers. This was proven when Helen admitted to John that she tried to lure at least one of her victims, Marcus Mackenzie, into the house to see what would happen, but he refused to go in. In the end, the cult of the Lightless Flame had overestimated their powers in taking Agnes to the House of the Web, and even though she burned the house to the ground, she remained tied to it. That was proven by her keeping Raymond's hand after his death. Later, Gertrude Robinson got manipulated by the web to visit the house and found a tin boy with clipping of Agnes' hair and the ashes. She tried to make a banishment ritual with it to stop the apocalypse of the desolation, but it backfired, probably because the web gave her access to the wrong books, and the two get bound together until Agnes dies in 2006. In the following years, 1974 till 2005, a land ownership dispute prevents the house from being rebuilt until construction for a new house begins in 2005. In the same year, Ivor gets hired by a construction company to do the wiring in the house. A guy who called himself Raymond Fielding, who smelled like burning human hair, appeared to him, and Ivor sees him staring at the tree in the garden. Then he disappeared, leaving scorch marks on the floor, which Ivor tried to clean up. This led to him slipping and ending up in the hospital, where a nurse told him a shortened story of the house. She also later sends him a priest to help with an exorcism of the house. Now 3 stories happen at once on November 23rd, 2005. First, Ivor gets visited by the priest the nurse sent over, who is called Father Edwin Burroughs. But when he asks him to wait outside, Ivor gets overwhelmed by hatred for the creepy tree in the garden. He chopped at it with a crowbar, which only seemed to make the tree bleed, so then he pulled it out with his car. And the created hole was the box of the web table that Raymond used to hypnotize his children. There was a still fresh-looking apple inside, which started to rot once he took it out of the box. Then it split and spiders came crawling out. The second thing that happened at apparently the same time is that Father Burroughs was now in the house trying to do an exorcism while Ivor was still outside. He already had some problems with the former exorcism, but he still tried again. Once he had started, he was beginning to feel alarmingly hot, and as he prayed for protection, something answered, but apparently it was not God. It made his lips move without making a sound, forming the words, "I am not for you, I am marked." He only got released after Ivor pulled the tree out of the ground. Then he fled from the house and had several other unpleasant experiences until he was arrested shortly after for cannibalism. Thirdly, Agnes was found on the same day, dead in her flat in Sheffield, where she was voluntarily hanged by her own people to give them another chance for a better avatar. Before the assisted suicide, she started having feelings for Jack Barnabas, which apparently made her too weak to do the ritual of the desolation. But it isn't made clear if the events of Hilltop Road made her decide to kill herself on that day, or if her suicide made it possible for Ivor to destroy the tree in the first place. The severed hand of probably Raymond was still tied to her waist when she died, and weirdly it seemed to have died at the same time as Agnes. Her age was given as 26 in the report of her death, which doesn't line up with her appearing 11 in the 60s at all, so at least it confirms that she ages differently to normal humans. So now it gets tricky. The first statement of Ivor was about the year 2006. It is also the time Martin found to be Agnes' death day according to the records, and Jack Barnabas claims the same in his statement about Agnes. According to John, the house started being lived in again in 2006 by 2 families who didn't notice anything paranormal since then. But the priest describes the exorcism being shortly before his arrest in 2009. To be fair, he wasn't exactly mentally stable when he gave his statement, so maybe he was just confused. But there are other problems with his reported timeline as well. According to him, his first botched exorcism was of a student in her 2nd year, called Bethany O'Connor, who matriculated in 2008 according to Sasha. So her exorcism had to have happened in at least 2009, but the priest said it took several years after her exorcism before he went to Hilltop Road and got arrested afterwards in 2009. This time discrepancy might be explained by the next statement about the house made by Anya Villette. She is a cleaner who was hired in 2009 to clean this new student housing that was built on Hilltop Road. Apparently there was still a tree standing in the backyard, even though Ivor supposedly knocked it down in 2006. Anya went down into the basement at some point, which was warm and full of cobwebs, and it had a crack down the middle. When she came close to it, she got pulled in by 8 spindly arms and woke up in one of the armchairs in the house under a dust cover. Apparently she got to the house on April the 23rd, 2009, but when she left it was April the 8th. It also seems that the world she woke up in wasn't the same, because there isn't any record of her existence, and no one seems to remember her. Clearly the whip in reality made by Agnes seems to lead to some kind of parallel universe. Another fact that might mean nothing, but seems a bit too close to be a coincidence. The nurse who helped Ivor in the hospital was called Anna Kasuma according to John, but Father Burroughs called her Anna Villette, oddly similar to the name of the cleaner. So my personal explanation is that the priest was actually part of another universe, where the nurse was another person and Bethany O'Connor died earlier than in our universe. He tried to exorcise Hilltop Road in 2009, but fell through the whip in reality and landed in our universe in 2009, where he finally got arrested shortly after. Another priest did our exorcism in 2006 and also fell into the whip, so that priest woke up in another universe. This explains the timeline problems and the name change of the nurse. Speaking of the different nurses, maybe the nurse of the other priest dimension, let's call it Dimension 2, who is called Anna Villette, is actually another version of Anya Villette, who lived in Dimension 3 and landed in our Dimension 1 after the cleaning incident. That would prove that the whip in reality leads to several different dimensions who all have different versions of the same people. Finally, as a rather anticlimactic ending, the last we hear from the house is in 2018, when John, Basira, Daisy and Melanie went there to find Annabelle and got a tape from her. But I'm pretty sure that the house will be relevant in the upcoming third act of the final season, and this isn't the last we heard of it. So did you have the story of the house on Hilltop Road still fully memorized? Do you think I missed something? Or do you have another theory about the wrong timelines and names? Tell me down in the comments.